give it a makeover.
Let's take a closer look at how the table looks beforehand. This table's only really been outside for about 2 years, but you'll see here we've got damage, we've got some water stains, spider webs, and we've also got some components where the timber's starting to rot. It's just looking really tired. Time for a budget makeover to make it feel fresh and new again. First up, you're going to need to head to your local hardware store. For me, that's Bunnings, my favourite place. So you're going to need to get a paintbrush, a roller, some varnish, and some degreaser. This is the varnish I chose for my project. I wanted a gloss finish and needed oil-based for durability.
Grab your paintbrush and let's go.
But before we paint, we have to clean. I know it's boring, but it's a crucial part to actually restoring or refinishing any piece of furniture. You're going to get some degreaser. I like to use a crystal format, mix it with hot water. Hot water is much better to clean with. And then we're going to get a sponge and start cleaning the piece. Depending on how long it's been since you last cleaned your outdoor furniture, you'll find that it is very dirty. Mine was covered in spiders underneath, inside the grooves. There was just spiders everywhere. I hate spiders. So I kept cleaning all the way through. I had to clean in between the grooves, and look how dirty the water gets. It is honestly disgusting. I had to change the water a few times because I wasn't going to keep cleaning with dirty water like that. So it probably took me 4 jugs. Now to get inside the grooves, I got an old bottle brush. I knew my kids' old bottle brushes would come in handy for something, and that's why I kept them even when we didn't have bottles anymore. So as you can see here, I got one side of the bottle brush and I'd press it into the crack so that I can clean all the way in between the table. You can use a few different things for this, but you'd just be able to find something around your house that you can use, a toothbrush or maybe another sort of scrubbing brush. You could even use the side of your sponge and tip that down sideways to get in between the grooves. Once I finished cleaning with the bottle brush, I then got my sponge back out and decided I had to go back over the table again. There was a little bit too much moisture on the table, which is bad for timber, but also is going to slow down the dry time. So I used the sponge to clean off any excess water to get to a point where it was only just slightly damp, and then I could let it dry naturally. I also wanted to clean the rest of the table. Even though I wasn't going to be painting the legs, I wanted to have like an overall feel that it was just a total refresh. So I got my sponge out, got some degreaser, and I cleaned the legs and underneath the table also. In our outdoor area, we also have timber bench seats. I'm going to be repeating the same process on the timber stools because I want to give them a refresh and give them a new varnish as well. If you don't have timber on your chairs, you're just going to need to give them a bit of a clean to help with the overall makeover. Next up is sanding. If you don't have your own sander, you're going to need to borrow a sander from somewhere because it's so important to clean off any damage to the table and get a nice surface for your new varnish to stick to. You might be able to borrow one from family and friends, or you might have a local tool library that you can borrow one from. However, I do love to have a sander around, and it is definitely worth the investment in getting a sander because you can use it in so many different house projects. It does take a little while to get the sanding done, and you want to try and keep your sander as flat as possible. That is difficult when you have grooves in the timber, but you do want to try and get a nice flat surface for your sander. I started off with a 120 grit here because I thought it was going to be easier to cut through the old varnish. However, I did need to swap to an 80 grit because it was actually stronger than what I originally thought. It was such a windy day, my phone went, yeah, boom. Back to sanding. So at this point, I've sanded off the original varnish. You'll be able to see here that the gloss finish that was on the table has now been removed. I've swapped to a 240 grit and I'm going over the entire table to get a nice smooth finish. It's time to get your varnish ready. You can use a screwdriver for this, or I'm just using my stirrer to open my paint tin, and then I need to give it a really good stir. There's so many components within your paint and you need to make sure that all of those components are mixed together nicely so that you're going to be able to use the varnish effectively on your table. I just love watching the paint. I find it so therapeutic. I just could sit there and stir it for ages. Now to start applying the paint. I just used a paintbrush for my first coat because I wanted it to get nice and thick, and I also wanted to be really able to push the paint into all those little grooves in between the table. I just dip my paint into the tin and then apply it onto the table, brushing to make sure that I've got it all over the piece. You will see as you're applying the varnish, the wood changes color. Timber always changes color when you apply a top coat, and a lot of people get a little bit confused when they're applying the top coat and the timber does change color. Here, you would be able to change the color of the timber before you apply the top coat if you weren't happy with the natural color of the timber yourself. So you could apply a darker stain, or you could lighten and whitewash the timber, but whatever treatment you're going to do to the timber, you need to do that before you apply the top coat. I was happy with the color of my timber and the beautiful timber grains that come through, and I just wanted to leave the timber raw. So I applied the varnish directly onto the raw timber without applying any treatment to the timber first. It appears as though it's a fairly slow process, but in real life, it's actually not that slow. It probably took me about 20 minutes to paint the first coat on the entire table. Once I finished applying the first coat, I had to let it dry. Oil-based paint does take a long time, and it took 6 hours to dry before I could move on to the next step. Once the 6 hours had passed, I was able to then start sanding in between the coats. Sanding is actually quite an important step because it then helps you create a really smooth finish on the table. For this process, I used a 320 grit sandpaper. However, you could use also a higher grit, a 400 or a 600, whatever you've got available to you, just a very high grit sandpaper to help smooth the finish off, get rid of any hairs or any dirt that might have stuck to the surface in its dry time, so that you can create a beautiful smooth surface for your top coat to sit to. After I finished the sanding in between, I grabbed out some wet paper towel and cleaned the table over again to make sure that there was no dust residue before I started painting my next coat. For my second coat, I personally decided that I was going to apply it with a roller. If you don't have access to a roller, you could definitely apply your second coat with a paintbrush, or you can use a roller. You can use a microfiber roller or a foam roller. Here I'm using a foam roller head. You're going to use the varnish, dip it into the container. I'm using a plastic bag here just to make the cleanup a little bit easier. And then I'm going to roll the roller across each individual piece of the table. You need to make sure that when you're applying with a roller that you're using really thin coats. If you want to have a thick top coat, you're going to need to apply with the paintbrush, and the paintbrush will actually have a little bit of a self-leveling property. However, the roller just gives that really smooth surface. I'm going to show you up close what I mean when I say don't have too much paint and the reason why in a minute. Here you go, that was quicker than a minute. The benefits of video. So, as you can see here, there's some tiny little air bubbles. It's important to make sure that you do not leave any air bubbles on the finish because they will dry with the air bubbles. If you leave the air bubbles there, when you come back and your varnish is dry, all the little air bubbles will still be there. So when you get your roller, you need to continuously roll back and forth with a reasonably dry roller to get rid of all the air bubbles before you leave it to set. Ta-da! All finished.
Pretty cool now, hey? As fresh as a daisy.
Let's take a look at the finished product up close. You'll see all those black marks are all sanded out, all of the damage has been removed, and now it has a nice gloss finish. For $35 in products and 5 hours of your time, you can brighten up and refresh your outdoor setting. Don't forget to help me out, like, share, and subscribe.